welcome back. In this unit, we will focus on two main questions. What is the link between climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction? And who are the main international actors and which are the main agreements for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation? Now, this is a hot topic as every time the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, comes out with a new report, it spawns controversy among some climate skeptics and governments. However, the IPCC reports have provided substantial scientific evidence about the clear links between human activity and climate changes. Yet, some disaster risk is linked to climate change, but so far the scientists have agreed that it increases the intensity and frequency of some hazards. These include sea level rise, heat waves, and regionally more frequent and heavy precipitation. The IPCC also very clearly states that most disasters occur due to exposure, vulnerability, and poor land use planning rather than due to climate change. Do you remember our example from Nepal? Climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction are similar in a number of ways. They both seek to reduce vulnerabilities in face of hazards. Both disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation operate in the context of sustainable development and poverty reduction. They also use many similar measures. Watershed management, which improves how water is managed if there is too much or too little water, can reduce current flooding and the likelihood of future drought due to climate change. You may ask what is different between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Then, for the most part, the differences are in terms of scope of issues considered and the timescale. Climate-related hazards are only one type of hazards that the disaster management community deals with. Disaster risk reduction seeks to address other hazards, including geological and biological ones as well. On the other hand, climate change adaptation generally has a longer-term perspective. Disaster risk reduction focuses at existing and more sudden risks, while adaptation emphasizes more slow onset and future risks in uncertain changing environmental conditions. In summary, when it comes down to on-the-ground activities, we realize that in most cases, the divide between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction is quite artificial. Most actions for adapting to climate change also reduce disaster impacts. Let's move on to our second question. Who are the main international actors and which are the main agreements for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation? The Hyogo Framework for Action is the key international agreement that sets out goals to reduce disaster risk by 2015. It was adopted by governments in 2005 at the United Nations World Conference on Disaster Reduction held in Hyogo, Japan. The Hyogo Framework identifies priorities and offers guiding principles for reducing disaster risk through national efforts. The United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNISDR, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1999, is tasked to ensure implementation of the Hyogo Framework for Action and its renewal. Beyond that, various international agencies, NGOs, and intergovernmental groups are involved in disaster risk reduction and support governments in the implementation of disaster risk reduction strategies. In 1992, the world's governments adopted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. 5 years later, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. This protocol legally binds developed countries to emission reduction targets. The first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol was from 2008 to 2012. The second commitment period began in 2013 and will end in 2020. Key international actors in climate change adaptation include also the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the leading international body for the scientific assessment of the current state of climate change. Climate change is expected to aggravate drought and the already rampant desertification in many parts of the world. The United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, which entered into force in 1996, is therefore also important in the context of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. This convention is a legally binding one that aims to address desertification and mitigate the effects of drought through long-term strategies. Finally, the Sustainable Development Goals are an important UN pillar. They cover a set of international goals for sustainable development, including aspects of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Congratulations, you made it! We hope you found this unit interesting, and don't forget to take the quiz to check how much you learned.